Today I want to take a few minutes and talk about an old story that has long been forgotten in the lore of the Florida Panhandle. It's a story of a months-long feud that culminated in 2 murders, for which no one was ever brought to justice. The whole episode was fueled by political differences, and it caused decades worth of grief for the family members who were left behind. I took a quick trip down to Greenhead, Florida, which is a small, unincorporated community located about 30 minutes north of Panama City. A man named John David Dykes, who was a member of a locally prominent family, was the postmaster of Greenhead in the early 1900s. Throughout much of the Panhandle in those days, lumber and turpentine was the largest industry, and those at the head of that industry held a good bit of political power. At that time, the largest opposition to the Democrat leaders of the area came from the largely agrarian Populist Party. A man by the name of S.A. Walker, who also lived in Greenhead, was the foreman of a turpentine camp close by. The dispute between John David Dykes and S.A. Walker began when Dykes, as postmaster, refused to allow Walker to pick up mail for his employees. His concern was that the mostly black employees were being forced to sign over authority to Walker, who, like some other foremen in the industry, might have censored or manipulated their mail. John David said that violated the employees' rights and also violated post office regulations, and he wasn't going to have any part in it. That and John David's outspoken opposition to Florida's then existing labor laws created a lot of bad blood between him and the heads of the lumber industry, for whom S.A. Walker was a sort of local frontman. Apparently, over the period of several months, various arguments were had between the two men, and at one point they actually came to blows. Dykes was said to have won the fight, and Walker allegedly vowed to get even. On April 14, 1916, John David Dykes was at a lake near his home when shots suddenly rang out. He quickly jumped behind a tree to take cover. Dykes insisted that S.A. Walker had fired the shots and run off. Later that day, John David's cousin Josh visited and reported the incident, but an investigation never happened, and I'll explain why in just a minute. Anyway, cousin Josh stayed overnight, and the next morning, April the 15th, he and John David got up early to go fishing. When they came back, they heard that S.A. Walker had himself been shot and killed. An unidentified black man had found Walker dead in his wagon along the road on the way up to Vernon, which was the county seat at the time. A coroner's jury was hastily convened and quickly charged John David Dykes with the murder, and soon a lawman turned up to arrest him without asking anyone any questions at all. Oddly, the only thing he did do was to take a moment and look at John David's gun, and strangely enough, he noted that it looked like it had not been fired recently. Meanwhile, it was discovered that someone had cut the telephone lines at the local switchboard, which, by the way, happened to be located in the general store building owned by John David Dykes. And then when 3 of John David's brothers heard of his arrest later that day, they attempted to board the train in Southport and head north up to Greenhead, but the train was allegedly purposely delayed to prevent them from making it up there. And by the way, for local folks, yes, there used to be a train line running from Southport up to Greenhead. Anyway, with all of this happening, a lynch mob began to form. John David was carted north to the county jail located at the back of the old courthouse in Vernon. The sheriff, who lived further north in Chipley, got in an automobile with a deputy and another man, and they headed down to Vernon to conduct the investigation. But about 4 miles down the road, the car overturned on a curve and injured all 3 men, with the sheriff being in the most serious condition. Later that evening, he was put aboard a train bound west for New Orleans so that he could receive medical treatment, and he would be there for the next several weeks recovering. With the sheriff out of the way, the lynch mob, which was allegedly composed of several prominent and well-connected men, had very little opposition. A few morally upstanding citizens heard about the possibility of a lynching, so that night they guarded the jail until about midnight, but then they left. However, Around 1:30 a.m. on April the 16th, 1916, the masked members of the lynch mob turned up. Some say they were even full of liquid courage, and they demanded that the jailer let them in, and they dragged John David from his cell, kicked him and beat him, and though he fought back like a champ and injured several of the mob members, they ended up filling him full of lead as he attempted to break and run down the street. The mob members disappeared into the night, leaving his bullet-ridden body laying in the street. One unnamed Vernon woman, whose husband had been told of the lynch mob's plans, reportedly exclaimed to her husband, "They're killing John David now!" as the fight was taking place. That man had confided the plans to his wife, but he didn't take part in the lynching, and out of fear for his own life, he swore himself and his wife to silence on the matter. John David Dykes was buried in a small cemetery on family land on the northern edge of Greenhead. S.A. Walker's remains were sent to Georgia for burial. No formal investigation ever took place, so therefore no one was ever formally indicted for either murder. The names of the members of the lynch mob were withheld from any kind of publication on the matter, and aside from being discussed by descendants of John David Dykes, the whole episode quietly evaporated into history. So many questions remain unanswered. Who actually fired upon John David Dykes on April 14th, 1916? Who killed S.A. Walker on April the 15th? Who were the members of the mob who lynched John David in the early hours of April 16th? To this day, there is no official answer for any of these questions. Whoever had the answers took them all to the grave. It's a sensational murder story that is destined to remain unsolved.